Mark Monroe, Claire Renshaw, and Matthew Hargrove. 3 seemingly ordinary people, bound by grief, guilt, and a shared secret. But when Father Thomas is found brutally murdered in the church he once led, the truth behind their involvement begins to unravel, exposing a dark web of betrayal, vengeance, and a long-buried crime. What had been hidden for decades is about to be revealed, and the small town of St. Augustine will never be the same again. Nestled in the misty valleys of rural Maine was the town of St. Augustine, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. It was a town where doors were rarely locked, where children played freely in the fields, and where the chiming of church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. The heart of this quiet town was the Church of St. Augustine, a grand stone structure that had stood for over 150 years, with its towering steeple, stained glass windows, and wooden pews polished smooth by generations of faithful hands. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was the town's center, both spiritually and socially. Weddings, funerals, christenings, and town meetings all took place within its aged walls. Presiding over the church was Father Thomas Riley, a priest in his late 60s with a calm voice and kind eyes. He had served the town for more than 2 decades, becoming a trusted figure in the community. People came to him with their worries, their sins, their questions. He offered guidance without judgment and comfort without condition. He had baptized babies, married young lovers, and stood beside countless grieving families. In many ways, Father Thomas was the soul of St. Augustine. But beneath the surface of this idyllic place, something was festering. In the final weeks of Father Thomas's life, strange things began happening in and around the church. At first, they were dismissed as harmless pranks. The altar cloth rearranged overnight, candles left burning long after services had ended, and hymnals found torn and scattered across the floor. But then came more disturbing signs. Cryptic symbols scratched into the church door, the statue of the Virgin Mary found face down in the garden, and strange offerings, dead birds, burnt, sticks and torn pages of the Bible, left in the pews. These incidents unsettled the townspeople, but no one could explain them. Father Thomas remained calm, assuring everyone that such things happened from time to time, especially near Halloween. Still, those who knew him well noticed a change. His sermons grew quieter. He spent more time alone in the sanctuary, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, the church lights would be on, glowing through the fog like a beacon or a warning. Then came Sunday, the most sacred day of the week. Families dressed in their best clothes, children clutched hymn sheets, and old couples shuffled slowly to the church. But that morning, the heavy oak doors remained shut. The church caretaker, Madeline Bishop, arrived early to unlock the building, as she had done for over 15 years. She knocked lightly at first, then harder. No response. Assuming Father Thomas had overslept, she used her key to open the side door. What she found would shake the foundation of St. Augustine to its core. The sanctuary, normally filled with sunlight and the scent of incense, was cold and silent. The candles were still lit from the night before, their flames trembling in the stale air. Madeline walked slowly toward the altar, her footsteps echoing eerily through the empty pews. Then she saw him. Father Thomas was lying face up on the marble, steps before the altar, his robes soaked in dark red. His arms were spread, as if in imitation of the crucifix that hung behind him. Blood pooled beneath his body, staining the white stone and dripping into the small grooves where the altar wine was sometimes spilled. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Madeline froze, too shocked to scream. The silence of the church, once comforting, now felt suffocating. After a few moments that felt like hours, she stumbled out the side door and called the police, her voice trembling with disbelief. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside the church. Families stood in stunned silence. Children clinging to their mothers, older men whispering to one another with furrowed brows. No one could understand it. Who would want to hurt Father Thomas? Why would someone commit such a brutal act in such a sacred place? The police cordoned off the area and began their investigation, but answers were scarce. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors had been locked and all the windows were intact. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The church's relics, some of them quite valuable, were untouched. Father Thomas's wallet and belongings were all in place. It looked like the killer had come not to rob, but to murder. The only thing out of place was a single black candle, still burning near the foot of the altar. It had not come from the church's supply. It was thick, oddly shaped, and gave off a faint metallic odor. Beside it lay a small note, handwritten in shaky block letters on a torn piece of parchment. "He who hides sin in holy robes shall bleed beneath the cross." The entire town of St. Augustine was shaken to its core. Grief quickly turned into fear. If a man like Father Thomas could be murdered in his own church, what safety was left? The people who had always found comfort in the old stone walls now felt a chill every time they passed them. The bells that once signaled peace now echoed like a warning, and so began the darkest chapter in the history of St. Augustine, a mystery soaked in blood, surrounded by silence, and rooted in a truth no one was prepared to face. Detective Lena Ward arrived in St. Augustine just before sunset, her boots crunching softly on the gravel outside the church. A seasoned investigator from Portland with over a decade of homicide experience, Lena was known for her methodical nature and her ability to read between the lines. But as she stood outside the towering church doors, she could already sense this case would be unlike any other. Inside, the crime scene had been preserved. The body of Father Thomas had been removed, but the bloodstains remained, dark and congealed on the marble steps. The altar stood solemn and undisturbed, and the air inside was heavy with a strange mix of candle wax and decay. Lena examined everything with sharp eyes. Nothing about the scene suggested panic. The attack was calculated. Each stab wound according to the medical report had been delivered with accuracy. No signs of overkill, no sign of a struggle. Whoever committed this murder had control, confidence, and likely a personal motive. Lena's first step was understanding the victim. She spent her initial hours speaking with the townspeople, especially those closest to Father Thomas. The community spoke highly of him. They painted a picture of a man who had no enemies, someone who had given his life to service. But Lena had worked too many cases to take words at face value. Everyone has secrets, even priests. One of her first interviews was with Madeline Bishop, the church caretaker who had discovered the body. Madeline was in her late 50s, quiet and reserved. She described the morning of the murder in chilling detail. The locked doors, the burning candles, the stillness of the sanctuary. She also mentioned something peculiar. Over the past month, she had seen someone lurking near the church at night. A figure in dark clothing, always at a distance. When she tried to approach, the figure would vanish into the fog. Lena took note and began reviewing any available security footage. The church itself had no cameras, but a local grocery store across the street did. The grainy black and white footage showed limited angles, but there was a figure, hooded and tall, seen walking toward the church on multiple nights, always around midnight. The footage was too poor to identify facial features, but it was a start. The next name to emerge in her investigation was Aaron Blake, a former altar boy turned troublemaker. Now in his early 30s, Aaron had a well-documented history with the police, vandalism, drug use, and a past assault charge. He had recently returned to St. Augustine after spending several years in and out of prison. According to townspeople, Aaron had expressed resentment toward the church and claimed Father Thomas had failed him when he was younger. Lena located Aaron at his mother's house on the edge of town. He was edgy and defensive, but agreed to speak. He admitted he had issues with the church, but insisted he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed he was in Bangor on the night of the killing, visiting an old friend. Lena checked. Security. Footage from a bus terminal and credit card transactions confirmed his alibi. Aaron was cleared. Despite Aaron's innocence, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. His bitterness toward the church ran deep. He hinted at something once, a vague statement about what happens behind the altar stays buried under it. But when pressed, he shut down. Days passed, and progress stalled. No new leads, no witnesses, and no murder weapon had been found. Lena spent her nights poring over the church's old records. She reviewed rosters, donation lists, even old confessional schedules. Then she found something that caught her eye, a logbook Father Thomas kept in a locked drawer. It contained brief notes about parishioners who had sought counseling or confessions without revealing identities. But one name appeared repeatedly in the weeks before the murder: D. Cross. No one in town knew anyone by that name. Digging into local registries, Lena found no one named Cross living in St. Augustine. But further cross-referencing revealed a Daniel Cross who had purchased land outside town under a different name 6 months earlier. It was a remote property deep in the woods, isolated and hard to find. Lena marked it for further investigation. Back at the church, another clue emerged. Forensics had analyzed the strange black candle found at the scene. It contained traces of iron filings, bone ash, and an unusual herb compound rarely found in conventional products. It appeared to be homemade, possibly ritualistic. Combined with the cryptic note, it suggested a deeper, possibly symbolic motive. Lena considered the possibility of a religious or spiritual motive gone wrong. Had someone believed Father Thomas was guilty of something? Had the murder been an act of vengeance disguised in religious symbolism? Or was it the work of someone disturbed, hiding behind the veil of spiritual retribution? The case had now evolved beyond a simple homicide. It hinted at something layered: revenge, secrets, and perhaps even guilt from the past. Lena felt certain that the murder was not random. Someone had planned it carefully, choosing the church not just as a location, but as a statement. With more questions than answers, Lena turned her focus to the mysterious D. Cross, unaware that the key to unraveling the murder of Father Thomas Riley would lie in the forgotten sins of the town itself, sins buried long ago, but never truly forgiven. The air inside the rectory was heavy with silence, broken only by the steady hum of an old ceiling fan. Detective Lena Ward sat alone, headphones over her ears, a digital recorder in her hand. She had obtained permission to review a set of recordings, made secretly by Father Thomas, confessions he had begun documenting over the past year. It was highly unusual and against church policy, but according to notes in his private journal, Father Thomas believed some of the confessions were too dangerous to ignore. He had started the recordings after becoming convinced someone in the Isa town was capable of doing harm. Most of the confessions were typical: whispered voices admitting to minor sins, gossip, lies, infidelity. But one recording, time-stamped a week before the murder, froze Lena in her seat. The voice was muffled and distorted, disguised using some sort of filter. The tone was cold, measured. The speaker confessed to planning something that would make the heavens shake and silence a voice that should never have spoken. There were no names mentioned, no direct threats, but the speaker referred to the priest directly. He said, "He knows what he did, and God won't forgive him, but I'll make sure he answers for it." Lena played the recording over and over, focusing on every pause, every syllable. This wasn't the voice of someone seeking redemption. It was the voice of someone carrying deep resentment and pain. She took the file to a forensic audio specialist who attempted to isolate elements of the voice: vocal patterns, breathing, pacing. While a full match couldn't be confirmed, the expert suggested it likely belonged to a man in his late 30s or early 40s, educated and emotionally restrained. That profile eliminated many suspects Lena had been considering. Her attention returned to the mysterious name she had found in Father Thomas's private counseling log: D. Cross. The townspeople didn't know anyone by that name, and public records showed no individual with that identity in or near St. Augustine, at least not officially. But Lena had found a land deed signed 6 months earlier by a Daniel Cross, using an address and a phone number that traced back to an isolated cabin deep in the surrounding woods. She made the trip there the next morning. The road was barely more than a dirt trail winding through dense forest. The property sat on the edge of a hill, the cabin modest and surrounded by overgrown weeds. A rusted truck sat in the driveway, and faint smoke curled from a chimney. She knocked on the door. After a long pause, a man opened it. He introduced himself as Daniel Cross. Mid-40s, calm demeanor, and eyes that studied her closely. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Lena explained why she had come, and he invited her inside without hesitation. The cabin was sparsely furnished but clean. Books lined the shelves, spiritual texts, theology, psychology. Daniel described himself as a faith counselor, someone who had chosen to live away from formal religion, but still offered guidance to those in need. Lena asked about Father Thomas. Daniel paused before speaking. He admitted to having met the priest multiple times in recent months. He said he had sought answers about the past, about his own faith. When asked about the name Monroe, he grew quiet. Then he told her the truth. Daniel. Cross was born Mark Monroe. 20 years earlier, he had lived in St. Augustine with his parents and younger sister, Elise. Elise had been a bright musical girl who sang in the church choir and was particularly close to Father Thomas. One summer evening, she vanished. No sign of struggle, no witnesses, no farewell note. The town assumed she had run away. The case was closed quietly, but Mark never believed it. He had spent years trying to uncover the truth, but with no evidence, and no one willing to speak. He eventually left town and changed his name. The grief became a scar he couldn't hide, and it festered into quiet obsession. When he returned under the name Daniel Cross, it was not for revenge, he said, but to search for peace and answers. Lena didn't trust his calm explanation. She showed him the recording from the confession booth. Daniel didn't flinch. He denied it was his voice. She watched his face for signs of deception, but if he was lying, he was practiced. He maintained his innocence, insisting he had never threatened Father Thomas, only questioned him. But Lena found his presence in town too convenient. She dug deeper into Elise's disappearance. Archived police reports were vague, missing statements, and lacking proper interviews. One report, written by the original officer in charge, mentioned a private conversation between Father Thomas and Elise days before she vanished. That note was later scratched out in pen. Why? That night, Lena returned to the church alone. She walked the sanctuary slowly, imagining the final moments of Father Thomas's life. As she knelt before the altar, something caught her attention, a loose tile beneath the pulpit. She pried it open carefully and found a cloth bundle tucked inside. Inside was a rusted silver chain, a small girl's shoe, and what appeared to be a page torn from a diary. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It spoke of fear, confusion, and a plea to someone named M. The last lines read, "He says it must stay between us. But I don't want to go back. I'm scared." Lena's hands trembled. The artifacts were old, but the implications were fresh. This was the first real evidence linking Elise's disappearance to someone inside the church, and maybe even to Father Thomas himself. Whatever had happened 2 decades ago had never been forgotten. And now, it was returning to the surface. One truth was becoming clear to Lena. Father Thomas had not been killed at random. His past had finally caught up with him. Rain fell steadily over St. Augustine as Detective Lena Ward sat in her temporary office, piecing together the puzzle that had shifted from a modern-day murder to a decades-old disappearance. The items she had uncovered beneath the church's pulpit, the chain, the shoe, and the diary page, were now logged into evidence, but their significance was already clear. They belonged to Elise Monroe, the girl who had vanished 20 years earlier, and they had been hidden by someone inside. The church. Lena was now sure that Father Thomas hadn't just known more about Elise's disappearance than he had let on. He had likely been directly involved. She began combing through archived church files, aided by a retired volunteer named Bernice, who had spent much of her life organizing parish records. Bernice remembered Elise Monroe well, describing her as kind-hearted and full of life. She recalled how Father Thomas had taken a particular interest in Elise's spiritual development. At the time, everyone had thought it was simply mentorship, nothing more. But with what Lena now knew, those memories began to shift into something far more unsettling. Bernice also remembered that in the weeks leading up to Elise's disappearance, Father Thomas had abruptly cancelled youth choir rehearsals and stopped Sunday school classes altogether. He claimed illness, but Bernice now wondered if that had just been a cover. The timing aligned perfectly with the last diary entry Lena had found, Elise expressing fear, writing about being alone with someone she didn't trust. The evidence was stacking up. Lena revisited Daniel Cross, Mark Monroe, and told him about the hidden items. His expression didn't change. He had long suspected Father Thomas was involved, but had never been able to prove it. What shook him most was the discovery that Elise had likely confided in someone she called M. That could have been him, her brother. But the context suggested it might have been someone else. Lena began cross-referencing everyone who worked with the church during that period. She found a list of staff and volunteers from 2 decades earlier, and one name stood out. Matthew Hargrove, a church janitor who had mysteriously left town shortly after Elise disappeared. No forwarding address, no resignation letter, just gone. The timing was suspicious. Lena launched a search for him. After several days of tracking, she found Hargrove living under a different name in a town over 100 miles away. He was now in his 70s, frail but mentally alert. When confronted with the name Elise Monroe, his face darkened. Lena pressed him, telling him about the items found beneath the pulpit. At first, he denied knowing anything, but after hours of questioning, the walls began to crack. Hargrove admitted that on the night Elise disappeared, he had seen her enter the rectory alone. Later that night, he saw Father Thomas carrying something wrapped in a blanket from the back of the church. He had assumed the worst but didn't speak up, terrified of what might happen if he accused a priest. He hadn't known for sure what he saw, but he couldn't bear the guilt. So he left. He said he'd tried to forget, but he never could. Lena recorded his statement and had it verified with a polygraph test. Though not admissible in court, it confirmed what she suspected. Father Thomas had covered up something terrible. And yet, that still didn't identify who killed him. The key, Lena realized, was not just what Father Thomas had done, but who else had known. Someone had waited 20 years. Someone had planned this act of justice or vengeance carefully. She returned to the list of names in Father Thomas's private journal, those he had counseled in recent months. Several were crossed out, but one remained uncircled. Claire Renshaw, a quiet woman in her 40s who volunteered at the church food bank and rarely spoke to anyone beyond simple greetings. Claire had grown up in St. Augustine, but little was known about her past. Lena pulled her school records and made a stunning connection. Claire had been best friends with Elise Monroe. The two had sung together in the choir and were inseparable as children. After Elise disappeared, Claire withdrew from school and later spent time in psychiatric care, something that had gone unmentioned until now. When Lena approached Claire for questioning, she noticed the woman's hands trembled slightly. She asked about Elise, and Claire's demeanor changed. Her eyes welled with tears, but she stayed silent. Lena then showed her the diary page and the black candle recovered from the altar, the ritual object. Claire stared at the candle for a long time before whispering that she recognized it. She had made one like it once, many years ago during Therapy to symbolize the death of innocence. It was enough. Lena obtained a warrant and searched Claire's home. In her basement, hidden behind a false wall, she found dozens of candles, identical to the one left at the murder scene. Each was labeled with a date and a name. One was marked with Father Thomas's initials. Claire Renshaw was arrested and taken into custody. During interrogation, she confessed, not with anger but with a calmness that sent chills down Lena's spine. She explained how Elise had confided in her, how she had known something was wrong but had been too afraid to act. When Elise disappeared, Claire blamed herself. She carried the guilt and the trauma for decades, watching Father Thomas continue his life as a revered man of God. Then, when he began preaching sermons about forgiveness and cleansing sins, something inside her broke. She decided it was time for justice, but she hadn't acted alone. "There were 3 of us," she said, her voice barely audible. "And we all wanted the same thing." Lena froze. 3? Claire nodded. 1 planned, 1 watched, 1 killed. The truth wasn't just deeper. It was far more dangerous than Lena had imagined. As Lena sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room with Claire Renshaw, the confession she had just heard hung in the air like a heavy fog. 3 of us, Claire had said. 1 planned, 1 watched, 1 killed. The implication of her words was both chilling and perplexing. If Claire was confessing to her role, then who were the other 2 people involved? And more importantly, what exactly had they done all those years ago, and how had it led to Father Thomas's death? Lena stared at Claire, whose face was drained of all emotion, the tears from earlier now dried. The calmness in Claire's voice was unsettling. It wasn't the demeanor of a woman who was simply confessing to a crime. It was the cold, detached tone of someone who had planned everything meticulously. Yet, as Lena pressed her for more information, Claire remained silent. She had revealed the involvement of 3, but had said little else. Who had played what role in this twisted sequence of events? Frustrated, Lena decided to take a different approach. She began by asking Claire about the others. Who had planned the murder? Who had been the watcher? And who had actually killed Father Thomas? Claire's face twitched at the question, but she didn't immediately answer. Instead, she leaned back, her eyes unfocused as if she were lost in a distant memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost inaudible. The one who planned was always the most dangerous. Lena's mind raced. Who could have been the mastermind? Behind this act of revenge? She needed to know everything, every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. But Claire wasn't forthcoming. Her silence was like a wall Lena couldn't breach. Just as Lena was about to press Claire harder, the door to the interrogation room opened. A uniformed officer entered with a folder in hand. "Detective Ward, we've just uncovered something you need to see," the officer said, handing her the file. Lena's heart raced as she took the folder, flipping through the pages quickly. Inside were details about Claire's background, including some disturbing information. Claire's therapy records, which had been sealed for years, revealed that after Elise's disappearance, Claire had spiraled into a severe depressive episode. Her sessions with her therapist were filled with anger, guilt, and a deep obsession with justice for her missing friend. Lena also learned that during her therapy, Claire had repeatedly referenced someone named Matthew. The name matched. That of Matthew Hargrove, the former janitor who had been questioned earlier. But what was his connection to Claire? Lena immediately ordered a second round of questioning for Hargrove. He was brought back to the station, and his demeanor had changed. Gone was the frailty of the elderly man who had confessed earlier. Now he seemed more composed, as if he had known this day would come. Lena wasted no time. "Matthew, or should I say, Matthew Hargrove?" she began, watching him closely. "We've uncovered something interesting. You and Claire Renshaw were more than just acquaintances. You were involved in a plan, weren't you? A plan that began decades ago and led to Father Thomas's death. Hargrove's face tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had known his secret wouldn't stay buried forever. Slowly, he nodded. Claire wasn't alone in her obsession with Elise's death, he said, his voice now laced with bitterness. We all had our reasons. She and I, we were the ones who truly believed Father Thomas was guilty. But we needed someone else, someone with the strength to act. Lena leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Who? Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He seemed to battle with the decision to speak, but eventually, his shoulders slumped, and he surrendered. It was Daniel Cross, he whispered, the name hitting Lena like a punch to the gut. Mark Monroe. He was the one who planned everything. Lena's pulse quickened. She had suspected Daniel Cross, but hearing it from Hargrove confirmed her worst fears. Mark Monroe, now Daniel Cross, had masterminded the entire plot. But why? What had driven him to seek such vengeance, not just on Father Thomas, but on everyone who had played a part in the cover-up of his sister's disappearance? Hargrove continued, his voice growing steadier. Mark, or Daniel, was always the one who stayed quiet, who watched. He never showed any emotion. He'd been watching Father Thomas for years, waiting for the right moment. He was the one who convinced Claire and me that we had to act. He was the one who came up with the plan, how to get rid of Thomas without anyone suspecting. Lena pieced together the timeline. Mark Monroe had lived in the shadows, changing his name and hiding his true identity after his sister's disappearance. But when he returned to St. Augustine as Daniel Cross, he had one goal in mind: vengeance. He had used Claire's guilt and Hargrove's fear to manipulate them, drawing them into a plan that would ultimately lead to Father Thomas's murder. As Lena processed the information, she realized that the murder was not just about Father Thomas's sins. It was about the entire town's complicity, the way they had turned a blind eye to Elise Monroe's disappearance, the way they had allowed a predator to remain unchallenged for so long. Father Thomas wasn't the only guilty party. The town itself had allowed the crime to fester, but now, with the full truth laid bare, Lena knew the final chapter of this twisted tale was approaching. She would need to confront Daniel Cross, Mark Monroe, and bring him to justice for his role in orchestrating the death of Father Thomas. But even as she prepared for that confrontation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness surrounding this case had yet to be fully uncovered. Lena was about to face the final twist of this long-buried mystery. The web of lies, deceit, and revenge was tangled beyond what she had imagined. But she was determined to bring every hidden truth into the light, no matter the cost. The investigation that had started with a simple murder was about to unravel the darkest secrets of St. Augustine.